Certainly there are many advantages, whatever faith you are, to marrying somebody of the same faith, whether it's heading in the same direction, bringing up the children in the same way, or particularly if it's a domestic faith where you've got food laws and home festivals. There are so many benefits to marrying someone within the faith. But you have to say that, you know, Ben and Jessica are only 50% of the story. And that there are many people who do marry out because it's a multi-faith society and it's pluralist and tolerant, which is great. And people who work together during the day play together at night. And therefore mixed faith marriages are inevitable. And the really interesting thing here is that just because somebody marries out of their faith doesn't mean to say they're rejecting their faith. So it's something that the religious groups have got to come to terms with.
Do you think more Jewish, within the Jewish tradition, more people need to come to terms with it? I mean, you presumably, you don't have a problem with it. Would you marry?
I'd much prefer to marry. I'd much prefer it when people marry within the faith. As I say, Jewish, Sikh, Catholic. But you have to also look at the other 50%, and a lot depends on whether they're lost or not, as to whether the community around them is hostile and says, right, that's it, you're out, or whether recognises they still can be Jewish or Sikh or Muslim or Hindu, and we help them stay within the fold, because many of them still have religious feelings and a strong sense of religious roots, and we don't have to say it's an either-or. For some people, they can love their God and love their non-same faith partner.
Yasmin, you have an expression that makes you feel that you might disagree on this.
I feel so against all of this, whichever faith it's coming from. I'm a Muslim. I go to mosque. I pray. My husband used to be a Christian. He's whatever he is now. He hasn't told me yet. Neither of my children have been forced into anything. They know what I pray. They sometimes pray with me. And I find it quite shocking, actually, that faiths can impose these things on their young people.
Do you sympathise with the situation of the Jewish community in particular because of the historical?
No, I don't.
Hang on, where did the impose come in? This is people making choices. That couple chose to within, yes, other people chose without.
But she said, I wouldn't want my children to do it. What happens if the child does want to marry out? With the attitudes that they've just expressed, it seems to me that they would find ways to put pressure. And it's not just the Jewish community, I stress. And I think this is one end. It's not a preference. It's saying to people, you're wrong to fall in love with somebody outside a circle. I find that intolerable, actually.
Ed, what's your view? Because, you know, it can seem sometimes that in this country that if you're vaguely Christian, you can have a church wedding. But of course, being Catholic, you know, does carry responsibilities, and it is an issue, presumably.
Yeah, and a lot of, I mean, I come from a very different situation. Both my parents were Anglican and Catholic. That wasn't a big issue in England.
So that was a kind of mixed denominational...
It's a kind of mix. I mean, it's funny because the taxi driver who picked us up, and I think he picked you up as well, he was saying how his dad was a Protestant and his brothers never spoke to him after marrying a Catholic. So that's the sort of one end of the kind of the real hurt. But I can understand, I mean, in particular, you know, they mentioned, you know, just 70 years ago, a third of the Jewish population in the world was murdered in one fell swoop. You can understand, in particular, their need to want to survive as a group. I do think, you know, more broadly, once religious groups once the barriers do come down, you know, the faith does start to, as much as we'd like to have a sort of all liberal faith, it does start to go, and eventually the children, and the children probably will not go to any religious service. I mean, some people might say... And of course, atheists
would say, and what's the problem with that?
But I don't think you can. What Jonathan says is absolutely right. If you marry out and you're Jewish or Sikh or Muslim, that the partner becomes a kind of part of the wider community. That's what's happened to my husband. My people really have accepted him as one of them, though he's not one of us, really. And that way you expand your influence, not destroy it.
Interesting you said marry out. That's a value judgment. Actually, sometimes it's the other partner marrying in.
Yes.
And there's no reason why, if religions can't be more welcoming, well, we can't say, OK, you didn't start off in our faith.
Yeah, but I mean, the more religions do become welcoming...
And accepting conversions. Well, that's an interesting point, because, of course, not everyone's as tolerant. I just want to bring in one other Jewish contributor here, because we're joined by Rabbi Dr. Moshe Freedman, who is from the Northwood United Synagogue. That's an Orthodox tradition. What's your view on the idea that you should be more welcoming, and maybe people would convert? Maybe you just have to embrace people who want to marry.
Well, we want to embrace as many people as we can, but the concern is that, particularly with interfaith marriage, firstly, it drives assimilation. There is no question of that, and that is a very great concern of the chief rabbi. But more importantly, for me as a rabbi, counseling individuals, it's very clear from the evidence that interfaith marriages are much more at risk of failing because of the tension that's created. Now, it's all very well. I don't deny that interfaith marriages can work, and Yasmin's example is fine. But in general, interfaith marriages are unfortunately not as stable as intra-faith marriages. So when people come to me and to ask advice, I've advised them to look within their faith. And I've had examples of young Jewish men who have been dating out. Their parents have been very concerned. And I've spoken through two very important issues. Because first of all, it's very clear that couples often don't talk about religion at the beginning of a relationship. It's not a very romantic thing to talk about.
Very good point.
But as a couple marries and the relationship develops, and particularly when they have children, religion becomes very important. And suddenly questions like, should we get our son circumcised, or should he be baptized instead? Suddenly those questions cause enormous tensions in a family. And there are very famous cases in America where that has resulted in...
You've raised such interesting issues that people can understand. Sorry to interrupt, Rabbi. I just wanted to ask you another question, which is, people can understand the idea of guidance, but to actually intervene and say to a couple, we don't think you should marry because your marriage isn't going to last, isn't that a very different matter? And isn't that about social pressure on the couple rather than accepting a couple who might want to make it work?
I'm not telling people what to do. I'm giving people guidance and informing them about things they may not have thought about themselves. I don't make decisions for people.
You've never told people to reconsider a relationship.
Themselves, but I want to give them the tools by which to make an informed choice rather than be swept up in the romance. Because the reality is that often couples don't ask the right questions when they sit down to get married, and these are very fundamental questions.
Briefly, if a couple said to you, we've thought all this through, but we still want to go ahead with our mixed marriage, what would you say?
I wish them every success, but unfortunately, I'm with the Chief Rabbi on this. I think that unfortunately the evidence holds that while some interfaith marriages can work over the generations, it will drive assimilation, and vice versa. Assimilation will also drive interfaith marriages.
Thank you, Rabbi.
It really concerns me very much indeed.
Jonathan.
I mean, Rabbi Freedman is certainly right that it is an issue. I mean, marriage itself is a bit of a minefield anyway at the best of times. When you've got the mixed faith element, then it certainly makes it potentially more explosive.
Isn't this about family pressure and social pressure, though? I mean, my mother gave me a question for the Chief Rabbi when I met him last year to say, a lot of my friends, they have daughters who were in good relationships, but in the end, when it came to marriage, their Jewish partners felt they couldn't marry out, and that was social pressure. And, you know, that they felt it was wrong, that the other side was very welcoming, whatever the faith.
Yes, I mean, some people will feel social pressure, but I run seminars for couples, and I must have counselled about 2,000 or 3,000 couples. They've never said to me, Rabbi, shall we get married? They always said to me, Rabbi, we are getting married. How can you help? And it's my choice really to slam the door or to welcome them back in. And the very curious things happened. Well, two curious things. Firstly, a lot of mixed faith couples have said, well, because we've had to sort things out in advance and do the right things that Rabbi Freedman was talking about, talk about issues in advance, you know, home life, children, circumcision, baptism, neither or both. Therefore, our marriage is actually a bit stronger because of it. And the other thing is that some couples have said, because I'm the only Jew or Muslim in the relationship, I've actually become more religious because I know that I have to fly the flag, and if it wasn't for me, the ceremonies would go. So I don't want to say that you become more religious by marrying somebody else.
Well, I always think of Marilyn Monroe converting to Judaism to marry Arthur Miller.
Well, I just want to say, I was married within the faith for a long time. And to say that, therefore, that kind of safeguarded the marriage is simply wrong. And secondly...
This was your first marriage?
My first marriage. And secondly, how would we feel if white Christians said the same? We don't want our people to marry out, don't want them to marry Sikhs. We would be really quite upset.
This does happen with other faiths. As you may know, there have been a couple of incidents at Sikh Gurdwaras where there have been angry protests over mixed marriages taking place inside.
Well,
I want to bring in Dr. Pyara Singh Pogel, who's from the Council of Sikh Gurdwaras. I know the Council has said they've absolutely condemned such protests. But what's your view on the concern about marrying out of faith?
Well, actually, good morning to you.
Briefly, because we're running out of time. Should Sikhs be marrying out at all?
Well, it is going on. It's actually going on at the moment. It's an increasing problem for all the religious faiths as well, because it's a free country and people are making choices. They're spending time at the university, work together, so they are falling into relationships.
Is it right, though? Do you think it's right they should, though, in brief?
Well, of course, if they love each other, because every religion shows the path of love. And if they love each other, then there is a chance that they should be working towards to meet the Creator. And to meet the Creator, it does help if you have the same beliefs.
Okay. Thank you so much. I also want to bring in Heather.
From within and be an individual choice. I mean, it's a deep matter. I think an aspect of this that we've not really talked about, I mean, we've been really discussing it very interestingly, but it's the individual experience. I think people are changed at a personal level by an interfaith, intercultural relationship. And, you know, naturally communities, families are scared, quite frankly, about what it means and long term and for the next generation. But for the couple themselves, that's where the real encounter has to happen, has to be worked out. I think the kind of either-or option, well, if you were married a Spaniard, you wouldn't say stop speaking Spanish. You know, you would engage both and have an interesting blend of both and a conversation between both and form a culture somewhere between the two, maybe taking the best of both, maybe more one more the other. But
I love the way that, thank you, Heather, you use that phrase about it. In the end, it's a personal encounter, Ed. Is that the most useful way forward? Because I know lots of people will be watching this who are not religious. You know, they might be atheists, and they'll think, you know, it's an obsession by religious people, and that's the reason we have so much trouble, is because they're not tolerant.
No, I think all religions traditionally have had a sort of, you know, walls around them and their community. But I also, you know, in the modern world, this does clash fundamentally with the idea of individual freedom, you know, and the right of people to marry their own. I mean, I do think, you know, there is a wider issue of parental influence on marrying a partner. We've gone to almost like another extreme now of individualism.
Well, exactly. I mean, you're talking about arranged marriage. I mean, in brief, it could be seen as an opportunity to evangelise if you're from that kind of faith background, and others regard it as it can only be dilution.
Well, I mean, arranged marriages is fine if it's done with the consent of everybody. But this idea that you have to make people live within the fold, I think, is wrong, because it is where we get to, in the end, is forced marriages with this.
And we're now
Jonathan,
really, I think, recognising we're in a different social context, and the old thing that the family that prays together stays together isn't happening anymore. It's much more privatised. I'm, like many rabbis, you know, I'm really torn between a mixed faith couple who say, on one hand, I'm torn between loyalty to tradition. On the other hand, when they say, look, we're in love, it's the best thing that's ever happened to us, who am I to disagree? And
let's have this discussion again in a few years, maybe in another generation, see where we are. Thank you. We have to end it there because your text poll votes are in, and we asked at the beginning of the programme, do child sex offenders deserve a chance to reform? And here's what you told us. 21% of those of you who texted in, so about a fifth, said yes, and 79% said no. And I know with these polls, you know, it's a thing about who feels strongly enough to bother to contact us. There is an acknowledgement that it isn't black and white, isn't there, Yasmin?
There is, and I think, you know, again, with working with these people, it's not easy, doesn't always work. There are all these psychological things that Ed was talking about, but we should give it a go when possible.
Do you know, as a reporter, when I've gone into court and I've seen someone up for a second offence who's done something awful before, you do wonder, how must that victim's family feel, that survivor's family feel?
Oh, I'd be furious. I mean, absolutely furious. And I would hate to be, I'd also hate to be a magistrate or a judge who had to make this decision knowing that you were responsible for that happening again. I mean, but I think there is a sort of change in attitudes. You look back at the 70s and how some of sex abuse was treated. I mean, people were given fines for actually pretty serious violent sexual abuses.
And maybe that's what's changed, is that there is a different general social climate in which the crimes are punished more seriously, and perhaps they can be treatments too.
Yes, there's two things going on. Firstly, we're talking about crimes against children, which are always much more emotive, evocative. And secondly, it's a relatively new crime in the sense that for so long it's been under the radar, not talked about, hidden away. It's only now coming into the open, and we're beginning to treat it like we've treated for years and years all those other major heinous crimes.
Well, that's where we'll have to leave that discussion. But thank you all very much. Some very, very difficult issues, and thank you for your honesty and for engaging so fruitfully. Thank you to all our studio guests and to those who contributed. Thanks to you at home as well. We hope you'll join us again next week for another edition of Sunday Morning Live. Until then, goodbye.